For this video, we are going to cover the lease that Zillow provides. And the reason why I'm going to cover it is because I've heard a lot of complaints from my consulting clients or people reaching out to get access to the lease that I use, that the Zillow lease is over 20 pages and it's just intimidating and also boring, so they don't want to read it. Totally understand that. That said, I think using the lease that Zillow provides, Avail provides, KeyCheck within Furnish Finder provides is a really smart way to go about doing your leasing. And the reason for that is companies have hired lawyers in the individual states that know what needs to be covered, and they have baked it into the lease. So it is a way of utilizing the bigger platforms to get a lease that makes sense for your state that would cost you a lot more if you hired a lawyer. So that's reason one why I like it. The second reason why I like it is, as a practicing real estate agent since 2017 that primarily works with investors, I am my own investor, I have my own tenants. I still felt like I learned something out of the Zillow lease that I pulled for Colorado. So my hope is that you would also have that when you pull it for your state. The third benefit, and I haven't tried to take off the watermark or use it, so I don't know if there's actually a charge when you do, but having pulled the lease out of Zillow for Colorado, I could download it and everything else for free. So my assumption is that it's free. It's just that I have my own lease that I already use, so I'm not using this. I'm just kind of comparing it to the lease that I do use and updating my lease based off of what Zillow is saying. If you want access to the lease I use, please just email me. I'm happy to provide it to you. But again, I encourage you to pull the lease for your own state. And if you want some help with that, reach out and we can schedule a consulting call about pulling the lease for your state and reviewing it together. On that note, I am not a lawyer and I am not a real estate agent in your state unless you are in Colorado. I am merely a real estate agent in Colorado that works with a lot of investor clients, and so I share this education, but the onus is on you to protect yourself and make sure that you are fully protected. And it is worth mentioning that the Zillow lease actually on the very first page says this is a lease that works for the state of Colorado. There may be rules or regulations within your city or county that aren't covered. And to make sure you're protected in that way, I just recommend Googling the planner of the day, plus the city or the county where you live in, calling that person and saying, is there anything that I should know that's particular to this city that I need to bake into a lease that is 30 days or longer? So that's the best way to protect yourself. By the way, if you found that planner of the day tip helpful and you think it's going to save you from a lot of headaches and heartaches in the future, please like this video. All right, let's get into the lease. Page 1 clearly states it's the residential lease agreement. It should have the address. You need to double check that. And then there's a disclaimer here saying that it's for the state of Colorado in this particular instance, but it's going to be your state as well. They're also saying if you modify anything on this document, it is no longer valid. Something that's important for you to know is that when you are building a lease, there are federal laws, there are state laws, there are city laws, and sometimes there's county laws. And so Zillow specifically in this lease is saying we're only covering what is applicable on the state level, and that your city may have individual laws or rules that you need to know about. All right, second part of this document is the table of contents. You're thinking, yeah, great, I know what a table of contents is. The only reason why I'm pointing this out is because everything under the rules addendum may not be applicable to you. So, for instance, you may not care about the lead-based paint disclosure because Colorado, at least, we only care about it from 1978 or before. After 1979, we don't have to disclose that in a real estate transaction, and I assume it's the same in the tenant laws as well. The section underneath that has to do with shared spaces and associations. So again, if you're not part of an HOA or any kind of association, then you really don't care about that issue either. All right, page 3 is the basic terms document. This is very similar to the welcome letter that I build out and give to my tenants. And basically what we're trying to establish is that this is a relationship between two parties, the landlord and the tenant. This is the amount of money due each month. This is the location of the premises, and these are the fees or the deposit. So you will see there's a non-refundable fee, and the example in this lease is a cleaning fee, but I actually recommend putting in a pet fee here too. So it's like you have the luxury of bringing in your pet, And that's just a fee to you. You're not going to get that money back. It's not like a deposit. It's just, we're going to take a one-time fee between $100 and $250 for you to be allowed to bring in that animal. And then underneath that, you will see refundable deposits. And I think this is a little bit confusing because they talk about a pet deposit and they also talk about a security deposit. Now, I think we should get rid of all pet deposits. And the reason why I think we should get rid of pet deposits is because the deposit is really what is going to make us whole. Someone comes in and they break this mirror or they trash my couch over there. I don't actually care if it was their puppy that did it or if it was their 18-year-old son that did it or if it was their 23-year-old daughter that did it. I don't care. I just need to be made whole by having that couch either replaced or repaired. We should stop thinking about refundable pet deposits and just think about refundable deposits. And the assumption with that is that you'll get the partial deposit or your full deposit back depending on the condition of the property when it is returned to you. Below that, we have rent for the month, and they talk about it both as the whole month and a prorated month. So a prorated month, the way that you would figure that out is you would take your whole month's rent, so let's say $3,000, you're going to divide it by 30. That gives you a daily rate of $100 per day. However many days they stay for that partial month, you're going to times that times the daily, however many days they come in for whatever partial month they're staying in. So for instance, if they are coming for the last week of the month, you're going to charge them 7 times 100, and it's going to be $700 for that week. And then the next month, it's going to be the full $3,000. And that's what they're talking about in that section. Okay, and then the next section is the rent for the last month. I'm not really sure why they have this isolated or it has its own section because I don't know why we would care about the last month's rent unless it was prorated. And if it's prorated, then it needs to fall under the proration section or talk about it as a proration. But nevertheless, they have it pulled out. And then the total due up front. So just as a note, I never hand over keys until I have the full security deposit, which I always make match the full first month. And I recommend that you do that as well, in part because you're not just protecting the walls, you have a lot of furniture that needs to be protected as well. I think people get in their heads about this sometimes in the midterm space because they feel like, well, someone's only staying for 3 months. But the deposit isn't based on how long they're staying, it's based on how much damage they could do. And when you have furniture, they can do more damage. All right. Additional occupant information. So I think this is really interesting. If you have someone signing the lease, but there's going to be at least 2 other adults there, maybe their spouse and maybe their adult child, we want to know who those additional occupants are, their names and also their ages. I think this is interesting because they have the occupant name and the age. The age seems to me like we could maybe get into some discrimination issues. Probably wouldn't recommend asking what the age is of the other tenants. It's just known that if they're over 18, you need to know about their presence. And this is true on Airbnb too, where you don't necessarily have a lease. But when you're negotiating with people and you're talking about having them come in for the midterm space, it is far more likely that you're going to be negotiating one-to-one there and that they're not going to think to tell you the names of the other people staying. And it is important that you have the names of the other people staying before you accept that request. Below that, 1.3, you have the property address. Underneath that, you'll see that it says the property includes all appliances, fixtures, and equipment installed on the property as of the start date. And then it's going to be defined below. So on page 4, we're going to have a definition of what all is going to be included. And you could put in the brand of your appliances if you wanted. I think a stronger move here, instead of documenting everything, is to just take video of everything that's major in the house. Couches, carpets, walls, appliances, so that if there's any damage or if it's replaced, you have a video that you can reference. The term, the fixed term. So the term of this lease will begin on November 1st, 2023 and end on February 29th, 2024. February of 2024 is a leap year, apparently. Okay, and then 1.4 is just the term, so the length of the lease, and it's saying unilaterally, neither party can decide to renew or extend that lease. It needs to be an agreement or the contract needs to be re-signed. And then it's saying, in addition to that, if the contract extends because the person continues to pay, then the assumption will be that it becomes a monthly lease and that the tenant has to give the landlord at least 30 days written notice if they want to leave, even after it's become a month-to-month tenancy. 5, the rent. What we really care about here is that we're saying we're defining the terms of how much the rent is going to be. We are explaining when the rent is due, and we are also explaining when the rent is due per when this lease is signed. So you will see first month's monthly rent is due upon executing this lease. So once you've signed the lease, the rent is due at that time. 1.5.2 covers additional rent, and in this case, I have put in there that the cost of utilities, the tenant is required to pay those. So again, this is something that I kind of arbitrarily do. It's 6 months or more. That's not a hard and fast rule for me. If someone wanted to talk to me about this, I would have some flexibility with them on it. But I guess I feel like if you're going to stay for 6 months or more, the utilities can be in your name. And then 1.5.3, manner of payment. So I like to take all of my payment through Venmo or Zelle. I do require it out of my tenants. If they ask me if they can pay another way, I tell them no. It is simply a bookkeeping measure, and it makes my life a lot easier. All right, page 5 is very similar to the terms. So again, we're just really being specific about what the rent is and a breakdown of the different rents. So we have the base rent, then we have parking rent if we're going to charge extra for the parking. We have storage rent if we're going to charge extra for any kind of storage. We have pet rent. So in here I've put $20. We have electricity. This says included in base rent, and then gas, oil, heat, etc. These are the things that we're going to have the tenant pay for if they're going to stay for longer. We have water, sewer, trash removal, landscaping, telephone, cable, internet, and then the HOA. An assessment would not really be appropriate. And then we have the HOA costs as well. I would never put this in there because you're charged an HOA monthly rent. Build that into the bigger rent, but don't put it as its own line item. It's just something that you have to pay for, and so you build it into their rent, but it's not something that gets its own line item. And then additionally, a condo assessment, unless you had a tenant that was staying there for like 8 years or something, I don't really think it's appropriate to pass on the condo assessment to the tenant. An assessment would be like if the roof needs to be fixed or the elevator needs to be fixed. This is more your responsibility as the owner of that property than it is for the tenant. So an assessment, it's confusing to me why they would have the homeowner condominium assessment on there, because 1, you're not necessarily advertising that, and 2, it's not appropriate for the assessment to be passed on to the tenant. Page 6 speaks to all the utilities and services that you potentially could be providing to the tenant. This is strange and it is different in the midterm space, so I like the fact that it's broken down here. My rule of thumb on this is that if you're staying for 6 months or more, everything is going in your name. And if you are staying for less than 6 months, it's going in my name. But different tenants are going to have different feelings about this, and I will tell you this much, I am more apt to negotiate with the tenant on their rate the longer they're staying. And there isn't necessarily a right answer to this particular issue in the midterm space. Okay, underneath that you have the security deposit. It just states what the security deposit, what the amount is, and then there's a link to the rules around the security deposit. 1.8, non-refundable fees. So tenant is required to pay landlord the following non-refundable fees on or before the date of the lease. Cleaning, $300. So cleaning is a pretty well understood non-refundable fee. Sometimes long-term tenants will want to negotiate that with you, and midterm tenants may as well. I haven't had a lot of people negotiate with us on that up front, but sometimes they show up and they don't feel like it's clean the way it needs to be, and so they'll clean it and then ask if they can have their deposit back. I have a property that has dark floors, so you can often see the dust on the floors immediately after it's cleaned, and so sometimes people will call me out on this. I don't love it, but in the big picture, I want the relationship to go smooth and I want to get off on the right foot. So sometimes I will split the cleaning fee with them or refund it to them or not really fight with them on it. It's happened enough times that it's just a perception issue from the tenant. It has definitely been professionally cleaned. but they're seeing the dust, they're unhappy, I want them to stay. 1.9, tenant insurance. So in the midterm space, I typically do not make my tenants bring in insurance because the property is all mine. So the personal property, the couch, the mirror, the desk, I own it all, as well as the walls. So I don't pay for it. It is a little bit of a weird issue with your insurance. So when I had bad tenants this summer and they trashed some of the couches, I had personal property insurance, and my insurance travelers kept telling me, well, you got to go back to the tenant and ask them about their insurance. And it's like, but they don't have insurance. It's not their property. So I think that there's not necessarily a great fix for this if you are renting on Zillow, Furnish Finder, Avail, because your insurance doesn't necessarily have a product that supports this, and the lease doesn't necessarily talk about it either. On Airbnb, this is why I recommend not putting in a lease, is because Airbnb does have protections for the host and for the host's property that they may or may not pay you back on. But my guess is if you have a lease in there, they're going to say, no, we're not going to pay you. You have to go through the court and through the lease to get the money back. Whereas if you don't have the lease in, you might have a better argument to get Airbnb to pay you. And obviously Airbnb has more money than the tenant that trashed your property does. And so for tenant insurance in the midterm space, 30 plus days where it's your personal property, I don't require them to bring in insurance. And I don't insure my personal property anymore because travelers didn't pay for it. So I'm also not going to pay travelers for personal property insurance when they're not actually going to insure my property. The best way to protect yourself is with the deposit and vetting your client up front. You might actually be better protected in Airbnb. On that note, I have never disclosed where my poor tenants came from, and I'm not going to disclose it here either, but it was not from Airbnb. If it had been from Airbnb, I could talk to you about that process, but those tenants were not sourced from Airbnb, so I don't know how they would have handled it. All right, 1.10 and 1.11, parking and storage space. Just talking about where the parking is, how much it costs to use it, if you're going to charge for that. Storage space, the same thing. And 2, pets. So they are talking about whatever pet you bring in has to be disclosed on the pet addendum. And then it talks about the damage deposit, which, as I've already stated, I don't like. On my particular lease that I built for this, I put in a $20 per month pet rent. This is just a dummy lease, and actually going through this, I think with Zillow, you have the choice of doing a non-refundable fee or rent, and just for the dummy lease, I put in pet rent. But honestly, a non-refundable fee would be better because I don't like the deposit. I find that confusing. The rent is also kind of confusing. I feel like you should just say, just like the cleaning fee, if you want to have an animal in here, you can, but you're not getting that money back. It's just a one and done, just like the cleaning fee. And that actually makes more sense too, because your clean might cost more because of the pet. So it's a more honest transition versus the rent or a pet damage deposit that you're going to potentially get back. You really, again, do not care where the damage comes from. You just want to be made whole and you want it corrected. Okay, so underneath that, additional rules, you're going to have a rules addendum, and we'll get to that as we proceed through this lease. And then a smoking policy, and so stores, blah, blah, blah. In addition to any other remedies landlords may have under this lease or under the law, the landlord may charge tenant a fee of up to $250 for a second and subsequent violations if the tenant continues to smoke outside of the policy. And then it also says tenant will not engage in or permit the sale, distribution, dispensing, storage, processing, cultivation, or use of marijuana or products containing marijuana or THC. I actually let my tenants smoke pot. I don't care. Pot really doesn't smell that bad. Cigarettes, I care more about. Smoke is not that hard to mitigate unless it's been like 30 straight years of smoking cigarettes. There are ways to get rid of that smell. Cat urine is really the big one, and that's why cats will never be allowed in any of my properties again. I think this is a good stopping place. We have covered the first 8 pages, so the first third of the lease. We'll pick up soon on the second part of the lease and explain everything that's going on there. So I hope this video was helpful to you. I will put out more videos soon on this topic. Check out these videos if you want more resources. Thanks.